Well, so far we've heard from Hawke's Bay farmer Steve Wynne-Harris and Lake Hawea Station owner Jeff Ross, and some diversity of thinking around the theme. Are we already regenerative farming in our systems here in New Zealand? Or, as one of our next guests on the panel has put it, is a craze from a US fad that we are already farming here and we just need to learn how to capture the value of. And we have on the panel today Maury, Leyland, Penno and Professor John Hickford from Lincoln University. Firstly, Maury, welcome. Thank you so much for coming into the studio.
Thank you.
And John as well there, coming in remotely. Let's just set the scene a little bit in terms of your background to bringing to the conversation today, as well as where we should be directing this discussion. Maury, could you please give us to today and what you're actively involved in from a governance perspective, but also physically on the ground on farm?
Yeah, sure. So I came from quite a long, originally engineering and then corporate background, the large part of that at Fonterra, so in food and farming, particularly the food part. And when I left Fonterra 5 years ago, I guess had a strong desire to be involved in food and farming going forward, but to help New Zealand, in our small way, because you can only make a personal contribution to New Zealand continuing to shoot to the future in terms of what we need to be doing better, getting to the right consumers, and really importantly, looking after our environment. So to that end, and we do think that we need to be farming a bit differently. So we've got right into farming. So we have a farming enterprise in North Canterbury, doing sheep and beef and moving that into horticulture at breakneck speed. So that is a lot of fun and challenge. And we're also looking at, we've invested in a number of food businesses, from businesses which exist, like Pure Food, which is producing high protein, nutritious food for older people who are struggling with their health, through to Leaft Foods, which is producing plant protein from green leafy crops. And the driver there was the world is making a shift towards plant protein. We don't think that's necessarily going to be at the expense of dairy and meat. There might be less, but let's make sure New Zealand is positioned at the really high end. But we really should play in the plant protein space. We can't really grow peas, soy in a competitive manner. And the way they're grown is not particularly fantastic anyway. What we do grow well is green leafy crops. So let's progress there. So we're making some fantastic progress with Leaft. And in all of those, there are some common themes about how we connect to the customer, what the customer's really asking for, how we put our farming practices to connect with that and really deliver on the promises that we're making to customers that they're wanting to hear. So that whole supply chain and how we farm is of absolutely critical importance to everything we do.
Thank you so much, Maury, and to you, John. The context of your involvement as both a professor long-term at Lincoln University, as well as, of course, a president of the New Zealand Agriculture and Horticultural Science Institute here in this country. John, can you just give us a bit of context around the years that you have been studying and progressing agricultural science for the benefit of both what our consumer demands, but also our farming environments as well?
Yeah, so I think what we're seeing, and Maury used some great words there, that we've got to add value, we've got to be able to show off that our value proposition, our supply chain is of the best quality, and we have a very good system, and we should be proud of what we've done, and a lot of what we've achieved has been on the back of agricultural science, and especially pastoralism, focusing on how to most efficiently use pastoral lands to produce high quality protein, and we're very good at that. So then when we see regenerative agriculture come along, and I use the word ballyhoo, which I think is a great word, and sort of illustrates the point that there's a lot of noise being made about this. We could easily assume that there's a flaw in our fundamental production systems, or that they're majorly flawed, or that we're having a huge negative impact on the environment. Look, everything everything we do on the land has an impact on the environment. What we need to do is minimise that. So in that context, I went to a collection of agricultural scientists some of whom are members of the Institute of Ag and Hortsci, some of whom aren't. And we put together sort of a picture, a profile from the soil up of how we saw regenerative agriculture fitting into things. And what we saw as the strengths and weaknesses and where we thought we needed to sort of get better understanding. So for me personally, I'm a geneticist, so I don't have a lot of flesh in the game in terms of how we run our production systems. But we had soil scientists and plant scientists and people who understand how we use those resources to produce animal protein, and I wanted their perspective. So that's what we put out just prior to Christmas, was a quite detailed report on how we see regenerative agriculture and what we think needs to be upheld. And of course, when you talk about what needs to be upheld, it has to be scientific. And so one of the issues that I think was most pressing was that we were seeing a lot of claims being made about what regenerative agriculture might do, but there was no substance to them. There's no underlying body of evidence or history of repeated testing to show that these claims actually were valid or not. And that's okay, but we like to see substance in arguments. I'd hate to think that we were sitting here in 4 or 5 years' time and going, actually, that was a really big mistake. This is not to say that what we're doing at the moment is perfect, and it's interesting to hear Maury say that. I think there's plenty of room for improvement in what we do, and there always has been in New Zealand farming.
And I do want to talk to you about that soon, John, around the areas of improvement that we can do here in New Zealand. And Maury, I want your thoughts on when there is no science present, does that not mean that holistically everything is super interconnected and we should be looking at it broader than just what's comes through in scientific reports?
Well, to some extent, I think we're talking at cross purposes, because I do think some of what's coming out of the United States and some of the reports that Jons' work quoted are kind of irrelevant here. We must look at New Zealand, a New Zealand context. We must pull back and look at how we can improve the environment that we're in. And I think science has an absolutely key role to play. And there are a wide spectrum of farmers working on a lot of things. So I don't want to focus on the corner of farmers who are maybe really picking up on some of those fringe practices, although those practices, they tend to lead to unexpected innovations over time. So I'm definitely not going to rubbish them. But most of the people, I think, in New Zealand working on regenerative farming are running commercial operations, want to have a happy and healthy environment. They want the soil, the water, the air to be clean and well, and they want to make sure they're making a contribution. Now, I think the role in science here, there's a lot of scientific papers from overseas. I heard Alison Stewart talk about this the other day. She said literally millions that we could pick up and put into a New Zealand context around the benefits of diversity, the benefits of agroforestry in a New Zealand system. I mean, the list goes on and on. So I guess my challenge will be, how can the New Zealand science system pick up and run at full speed to work alongside these farmers, say, here's some research that we know exists, let's see how it sits in a New Zealand context, or I'm curious about these observations that you're making, let's consider what the scientific question is, dive deep into that and build up the case. Our business is not interested in doing anything that's not scientifically backed up, but sometimes it's the same in complex health issues. When you haven't got the science telling you what the recipe, what the formula is, sometimes you try things and then you hope that the scientists will run forward. So I guess that would be my challenge. And I think also, we need more young soil scientists. We need more people moving into this field. Youth today are very interested in food and farming production and how it's done. They need to know they're working on future solutions, not working on past solutions. So let's ask some new questions and answer them.
Yeah, John, what's your thoughts on the direction of science based on what Maury just said there?
Well, it's actually quite interesting because I think one of the things we've witnessed over the last 20 years in New Zealand is ever reducing funding going into agricultural science in New Zealand. And you wouldn't have to go far to find a few hundred agricultural and horticultural scientists that would say that. We've drawn away from what we did. So we are currently running production systems in New Zealand, in many cases based on science that was done in the 60s and 70s. Now the emphasis seems to be going more and more on innovation and short-term thinking and politically appropriate thinking, as opposed to looking at deeper issues. And that too has worried me for many years, that there are basic understandings about what we can do with our land and how we should manage our land, how we ensure that we don't have negative impacts on waterways, on biodiversity, that aren't being done because we're not putting the money into it. And I know that's always the catch cry of scientists, but the money's been going into things at times that have yielded very little benefit to our land management practices, to our production systems, to the value of the product we produce off those systems. Our big companies, Maury was saying she worked for Fonterra. Fonterra has been good in that space. It's actually done a phenomenal amount to improve our understanding of nutrient flows, these sorts of things, working with Dairy New Zealand. But the amount of money going into those things has actually reduced markedly.
Maury, what is the role there of the supplier, the processor, to invest in R&D and the corporate responsibility of that in its flow and effect?
Well, there's a role of the supplier and the processor. That certainly is true. But I could not agree with John more in terms of the role of our national focus, having a national strategy which goes towards the future, funding our research institutions and universities to go in those ways. I think everything John just said, I largely am in strong agreement. Food and production is very important to New Zealand and will remain so going forward. We need to make it a national priority. A lot of our practices, like John said, are based in the 60s. I think we can do a lot better. We have great scientists. We have great knowledge. Farmers, clearly there's this big group of farmers who have got a real performance mindset, continuous learning, adaptive. Let's harness the strengths of all the things we're talking about and take that forward. I don't think we need to argue about regenerative farming in America is bad or not us. I just don't, let's not go there. In our country, in our context, we've got issues environmentally with our fresh water. Even if we say our soils have relatively good amounts of carbon, we have big erosion problems. We don't understand the carbon side well. We need more science and data. So let's pull together. And
I do want to talk to you about that, John, because I discussed that with Steve around our winter grazing practices in New Zealand, and therefore there has been a lot of science coming out of universities and Crown Research Institutes that has led to heavy winter grazing on fodder crops and have had a flow-on effect. You would not disagree with the fact that we do have issues in the room that we do have to address, and if there is a management system such as some of the principles of regenerative agriculture that can assist us in a way that's going to help with our freshwater quality and our climate challenges, that could only be a positive.
Yeah, look, and I mean, you take your winter grazing, there's work to do there, and we really need to focus on that. And you and I have discussed that previously, the need to have better practices, and they're not good systems. We can improve upon those. I mean, perhaps showing where politics has got in the way, we can go back in recent history to 1 billion trees initiatives. We know that monoculture, plantation forestry can have a huge negative impact on the environment, but it was pushed strongly as a means of making money and offsetting carbon, but it's not a particularly elaborate or smart means. And when I saw high quality farmland going under Pinus radiata plantation forestry, I mean, you just despair. In that context, some of us have said if it had been 1 billion fence posts rather than 1 billion trees, then we might have been able to fence off some of that land that is of limited value to production. A lot of the land that has a unique biodiversity values, and of course we could fence off waterways. Farmers often don't have the capital or the cash on hand to be able to build fences, but fences and fencing could have had a huge impact and positive impact on how we manage our land resources far more responsibly, and it would have had a much better impact than a billion pine trees or a billion monoculture plantation trees. So, fencing, better land management, appropriate use of land, these are the things that we've really got to think about now in New Zealand. Is what we're doing on this land, is the system we're using appropriate for the land that's there, and can we do it better? And if we're going to spend money, that's where I'd like to spend.
I think there is a big discussion to have about trees and how we use trees and how farming and trees work together. I think there's a huge discussion. But coming back to what we're doing on farm and things like winter crops and fodder beet, we're growing fodder beet and we're still growing it as a monoculture, although we're going to try some different things this winter as well. But so we're trying direct drilling it instead of precision drilling it. We've got pastures alongside it, which are mixed forage, high protein, high fibre. We're putting an extra gate so that the stock can move in and out. But this is not based on the science or a beef and lamb report. This is the standard recipe would tell us to not necessarily focus on some of the things we're doing. So could the science please catch up? And we might be doing it all wrong, but give us some suggestions and how we do these things differently and better. Rather than leaving us in the space of winter crops are bad, but where do we go from here?
That's a valid point, John, because if we were to farm based on when regulation and science caught up, we wouldn't lead the world in some of the principles we do today.
Yeah, I mean, fodder beet has taken off as an example as a wintering crop because it is so good. It's such a phenomenally great source of nutrition. However, it isn't necessarily the best one in terms of the impact on the environment. We know that. So it's a matter of adapting our practices around the use of fodder beet to minimise the environmental impact. And some of the things that Maury suggested are the sorts of things we should be investigating. But again, they can only be investigated if we put the money into investigating them. So if we take fodder beet, there's obviously been seed companies that are selling the seed that farmers have been using. There have been systems developed around extensive planting of fodder beet, and that's well and good. And farmers make money out of its use. There's little doubting that. But it is having an impact, and maybe we do need to look at that, and money needs to come from the agencies that might fund that science, so Ministry of Primary Industries, the likes, and they need to start to fund and look at alternatives or better ways of managing the use of those sorts of crops. It's not necessarily a new thing. I mean, we know that Southland farmers have wintered on Swedes for years, and then along comes fodder beet, and hey, it's better than Swedes, and some people dispute that one, but it's about the management systems, and it's those systems and the advice around those systems that has been really wanting for money now in New Zealand for 25, 30 years. And stress the advice around the use of the systems. I mean, we got rid of some of the advisorial services that the government used to pay, but seen as a subsidy to farming. They went, but they also led to better practice on the land. And some people would argue we need those systems back, where we give sound advice to farmers on how to better use the systems they've got and minimise their impact. So it costs money, unfortunately, and using fodder beet makes money for farmers, and that's the challenge. Yeah.
Can I just wind back to your original question? Because John's right, we need more funding in these spaces, but the farmers who are calling themselves regenerative are trying these things. So how is that bad, and why is there such a disconnect? Because I think we all agree new things need to be tried here, and to have a look forward, how might I do things differently? How might I think about this? How can I gather views of those around, whether other farmers, because other farmers are a ready source, or scientists, but as we've just discussed, there's no science to help here. How is this bad? I mean, the farmers are going forward, trying new things with a performance mindset and an improvement mindset. This, to me, is hard to say is a bad idea for our country.
John?
Yeah, but you don't need to label it regenerative. So, I mean, if you go down the pathway again...
Can I just ask, why is the term so threatening to the science community?
I don't think the term is threatening, but implicit in regenerative is it insinuates immediately that everything that isn't regenerative is in some way degenerative, or it undermines the value of what we currently do, or it suggests that what we're currently doing isn't already doing it. So you've talked to Jeff Ross already this morning. You've looked at some of the things he's doing at Lake Awea Station. Fantastic stuff, and of course Jeff sells that really well. But he's actually not doing anything on the land there that isn't being done everywhere else, really. The practices he's using are great things. I wouldn't knock him on that. But you don't have to put a label on it. You can just say, actually, it's good farming is what we do in New Zealand. That stated, there are things we do that are negative and that we need to start to look at and say, well, can we do this better? So if you take the fodder beet example, I blow Lincoln University's trumpet on this one. We were looking at cut and carry methods for the use of fodder beet, where you don't have to have winter grazing systems. You can have systems where the feed's taken to the cows. You can go down that pathway a lot and then have housed cows. But is that where we want to go in our production system? So we are doing that research. There are alternative ways of thinking of how we use something that's as good as fodder beet. But again, that requires money and it requires people that can do that research. And that research was being done at Ashley Dean Farm.
I think we need to get over ourselves of being hung up on a term. We know we have, I love New Zealand, I love the way we farm, there's a whole lot of good, but do we think that we're the best that we can be? Do you think Peter Burling wakes up in the morning and thinks, I can sail pretty well, so don't tell me I can sail any better? Regenerative is a term customers want, the big food companies around the world, they want it, restaurants want it. Let's show them what we can do. Let's demonstrate how we are regenerative. And yes, there's a lot of definition we need to do in terms of what promises would we make to customers about that and how would we demonstrate it with the data and authenticity to show that that really is true. That is a big gap. But can we focus on that gap, not on the word? I don't think anybody here is saying New Zealand farming is rubbish.
But I think that illustrates one of the problems there, Maury, is that individual farmers don't get up in the morning and plan to farm badly, and many of them get up and do exactly what Jeff Ross and many others are doing. The problem is that then you have big corporates who, and I'm not knocking corporates here, who have to sell a product, not necessarily the farming system that produces the product. So be it the likes of Alliance Food or Fonterra or A2 Corporation, they're selling a product, but they cannot easily describe the production system of every farmer that's supplying to them. So this is where progress has to occur too, is that we need to get it to where our corporates, our big food sellers, our big exporters can describe in specific terms the farming systems that their suppliers actually are using. And that's going to take a lot of time because until recently, Fonterra was obliged to take everyone's milk, as you know. Now they are setting good standards and they're probably moving at a speed that's appropriate given the constraints on the business that they have in terms of their existing client base. But I'm sure the people selling Fonterra products or the various brand marketers would love to think that they could say, look, here's a model system that we all use. But there's a huge tail end of farmers supplying to those agencies who aren't necessarily where we need them to be. And so we can't have individual farmers selling their product. There are some that do, and I know that. I mean, we look at our fine wool industry. It's a classic example of individual farmers pushing their production systems and selling it at really high values into Italian markets, these sorts of things. But if you're a meat producer or a milk producer, you need to work through big corporates, you need to work through marketing departments, and it's really hard to get a good, clear message going to the market of the quality of our production system. I don't know who can drive that easily. I think government has to be involved at that level, and so people who are selling our product overseas or negotiating trade access have to be selling the merits of our production systems. But I think it's asking a lot of an individual farmer to do that. Jeff Ross, he's very good at it, we know that, but I'm not convinced that every farmer that I know has the capability of doing that easily.
Some great points. I think your original question about suppliers and processors, I think there's a real role for them to play in there. Coming from different background, I find the sheep and beef to be the what's asked. It's the opportunity for market signals to get to farmers and for that communication flow to go backwards and forwards. And overall, I find it a little bit low on aspirations. Is my experience coming in relatively new. So I think a lot of those companies are working on this really hard right now. I think that's the work that needs to go on. There needs to be clear messaging about what customers are looking for. Synley and Fonterra's, they're working with customers who've got some pretty high expectations about farming systems. And we need to get that in place so we can say our farming system that I am promising you with this product is X, and here is how I can show you that my suppliers are delivering to that. And I might not be able to accept every supplier. I can only accept the very top end or the ones which are working towards that. Yeah. The role for the tail end is not here. That's commodity products.
John, how do we have been led to believe that we talk to ourselves within this country that we can tell a very complex story efficiently overseas against a term that has coverage in Vogue, Netflix, and is demanded by the major retailers in the US and Europe? And how do we strongly believe that we're going to get that complex scientific system that you're describing away into something that's unique in New Zealand, that without using the term regenerative?
Simple answer is I don't know, Sarah, but that's true. I just simply don't know. It's a great term. It's a feel-good term. It has a value. It makes you feel positive about what you might be buying at the supermarket. That's why it works. That's why Vogue and others will pick it up. That's why politicians in this country are running around talking about it too. It sounds good. It sounds like we're doing things the right way. Getting the technical detail in there is devilishly hard. And so we need the big companies, we've mentioned some of them here, but even the smaller companies, to really sit down, look at the suppliers, the people that are giving them the product that they're then marketing offshore, and start to tell a detailed story about what the value proposition is in there, and the beliefs and the things they're trying to achieve in their production systems. Some people would ask that's going to require a little bit more sort of fractionation or diversification on what we do. Individual brands pushing, I see today talk of $5,000 a kilogram for Manuka honey, and that's a single brand. I won't give them the shout out on this one, but these are the sorts of things. But it's going to be a lot harder for your average sheep and beef farmer in North Canterbury, and I know a few, to take their product and put it into a specific international market, because they probably don't have the capital to go out there and create the supply chain, the processing chain, and they're running narrow margins as it is. We know the profitability of sheep and beef farming is not great for, a lot of the time. So they just don't have the resources to do that. So it is going to take the likes of the big meat companies and some of the smaller, medium-sized meat companies to get out there and really sell the virtues of our system. We scientists can't. We can describe them in infinite detail. We can tell you how robust the systems are. We can tell you probably more about the weaknesses of the systems in terms of nutrient loss, these sorts of things, than we can the positives. But we do have to tell that story. And I just don't think the individual sheep and beef farmers, especially, or dairy farmers, have the resources to do that easily.
They don't. Let's diversify. Let's get them, the big meat companies to, they're building new programs all the time with premium margins. Let's aspire to join those programs. They've got higher standards than others. Let's have smaller companies doing different things. Let's diversify. We're growing hops. Hops are small in New Zealand. New Zealand hops are loved overseas. What are the smaller things that we can be doing? Jeff and Justine Ross are amazing marketers. We're not. Can we find a way to be that? No, but we won't be marketing our meat from the farm. We've got too many other priorities. It's not our talent set. We want to be working with the companies who are thinking about the market and providing the programs with a big premium. And if we do everything right, we can have that premium.
I want to talk about diversity building resilience. Maury, I know that from previous speeches that you've given and John, the work that Pablo is doing at Lincoln University, pulling together the international conference Multiscapes in July. What does multi-land use both mean to both of you, and how can the principles of regenerative agriculture build resilience through diversity, regardless of the term that we're using?
Well, to me, one of the important themes of regenerative agriculture, the first theme is that you've got to see your farm as an ecosystem where you're working to improve the health of that whole ecosystem. And the second is thinking about diversity in all its forms. So looking at each piece of land, and John talked about this already, and thinking, for this piece of land, what is the best use, not just for me, production-wise, yield-wise, but is there an erosion issue? Might it be better in trees? Should I be fencing this area off? Is this the high production areas of my farm, and I'm going to focus here? If I'm not producing, a seed crop or a crop that needs to be a monoculture, is there an opportunity for me to have a diverse sward if it's a perennial pasture? Is there an opportunity for me to have companion crops? I mean, I think there's a lot of role for diversity within a farm and across farms. We're going a little bit further than that and saying let's introduce horticulture. That does require a whole lot more infrastructure and complexity, so that may not be for everybody, but we need to think about diversity, including in people, in its many forms. And I think there is science now to back up the benefits of diversity from a soil, plant, animal health perspective.
Look, great. I mean, I work with, you say, North Canterbury. I work with one North Canterbury farm that has 9 different income streams that protects them. So they're classical sheep and beef producers, but they're also working on elite wools, and they've got some ideas there about how they can produce higher value products off their strong wool at the moment, and there's some great work going on there. They take huge amounts of manuka honey off that property. They have carbon credits. They also produce timber. They have extensive plantation forestry. They also have hunting. They are working on preserving large tracts of native totara and cedar forest. 9 income streams protects them as a farming family.
That's pretty regenerative.
They're doing everything right. They know how to feed stock, and they don't need to do it by importing US systems. They're doing it on the back of sound science and their own approaches and understanding their land and using it more. And they're just putting in another 30 kilometres of fencing. That was their big move. That's not cheap investment in land, I might add.
So why can't we in New Zealand call that regenerative? Why can't that be what we sell to the world?
Well, we can call that regenerative. I have no trouble with that. It's certainly not organic if we want to go down that path. I have no trouble with that, but it's just a label. If it's a label that adds value to our products overseas, let's do it. I have no trouble with that. But if it's a label that condones practices that are holistic or feel good or unverified or out and out dodgy, no. So we probably need to define a New Zealand definition for regenerative.
And you gave me the best segue into my question for Maury, who's sitting on the Te Taiao Steering Committee and the Primary Sector Council Vision, whereby Damien O'Connor has said on Sarah's Country, look, stop calling it regen, then call it Te Taiao, and let's take ownership over our own production systems. Can you give us an update into where the work is progressing in that field at an industry top level?
Well, it's still pretty early days, but out of the primary sector working group last year, there was this concept of stepping back and thinking about what if we think about in partnership with a conventional and Maury view. So let's not focus on, what it's partnership, right? Let's all put our best brains together and think about this. If we think about nature being well, our farms being well, our people being well, and then we put the lens of our farming and our production systems and our profit systems through that, how might we come up with a New Zealand system, an Aotearoa system, which when we take that to the world, in whichever way we stamp it, verify it, authenticate it, show that it goes through the supply chain, how do we take that to the world? Now, I think there's an unknown question about whether you need to include the word regenerative in there so the consumer sort of recognises this thing they're very interested from watching various Netflix documentaries or not. but how do we put our own flavour with our unique strengths and the real benefits that we do have, but keep moving forward at high speed and build on the partnership strengths, knowledge and inherent capability that we already have.
Jon, just before I ask you both for a summary in terms of the direction in the next 12 months that you'd both like to see, would it not make sense that the science community embrace something whereby a lot of philanthropic, government and industry funds are going into defining and supporting a market position that will have a premium if you yourself said that science funding is being restricted and of course to progress what has been said is not based on sound science could be an opportunity for New Zealand's agricultural and horticultural scientists?
Well, the funding's there already. I mean, the money's being spent. If you're talking about creating a brand, something that we can sell to, and I think Tataya is a fantastic brand. I'm wholly supportive of that, provided the partnership is there and there is tangata whenua involvement. That's a good brand to sell to. Let's be proud. Let's do it the New Zealand way. Science underpins that. I don't know if science necessarily has a voice in the creation of brand. Science ensures that when you create the brand and someone goes digging a little bit deeper into the brand, that the claims being made in the brand are actually justified. So science provides the foundation to sell our better systems. And I wholly agree. We've got to get out there and sell the quality of our production systems. They are really good. And we focus at times negatively on the dairy industry and we say, oh, look, high nutrient flows and these sorts of things. But it is the most carbon efficient dairy production system in the world. Research is showing this. We've got to be able to take that science, embody it in a brand and sell that and make money out of it. That's the challenge to us. If it's a unique brand like Tataya and not regenerative, but you can say, look, it's drawing on sound science and regenerative practices and other things that we value in New Zealand culturally, this is brilliant. We can do that. New Zealand is very good at charting its own path in this world. We should do it more often. So science creates the foundation. It doesn't create brand, it underpins the brand. And of course the beauty of science is that it isn't just about New Zealand science, it's about taking everything we know about the impact of plants on environment, the impact of pesticides, these sorts of things, everything. Science integrates all the information around the world that we know about agriculture and says, yeah, we're doing that in a New Zealand context and this is the impact of what we're doing in New Zealand. So it provides a very solid foundation so that someone out in the market can't say, hey, but you guys are just spinning a yarn here. It can actually provide the substance to what we're doing.
Okay, to close, I'd like to ask you both, where would you like the conversation to be steered over the next 12 months around the term regenerative?
I think that Jon and I have talked about a lot of things which we're in very strong agreement with about where the country could go, some of the gaps, some of the things that we need to focus on. So I think we need to pull together on our future, get the funding lined up, find the fabulous scientists to line up and work on some common goals, because I think there's no need for this country to have a divisive debate. I think we can go forward with a high performance mindset, improving, adapting, and get to some great outcomes.
Jon?
Yeah, look, I would agree with that entirely. We've got to front foot it. We've got to be looking forward to how we create value in the market and how we ensure our long-term viability as a country. And yeah, we could look at it negatively. We know that, if we went too far down the holistic feel-good pathway, it could be our undoing. But we don't need to focus on that. We can focus on the positives and the things that are still challenges for us in terms of maximising biodiversity gains and improving water quality at the same time as we sell what we've already got as being a really good system. So, yeah, let's front foot it.
Fantastic. I really enjoyed that discussion. Thank you so much, Professor Jon Hickford from Lincoln University, involved in Ag and Hort Science Institute of New Zealand, and Maury Leyland Penno, former Senior Executive at Fonterra and, of course, co-founder of Leaft and Pure Foods, as well as farming in North Canterbury. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us around this discussion here on Sarah's Country.